Hello and welcome to another episode of the Truth C Squared podcast. My name is Shmez, joined always good friend and co-host Colin Carlson. We have a few things we're going to get into, but I just wanted to really quickly, super quickly, go over this article that Stratton actually wrote in response to a question I had with one of his arguments. And this has been out for a while. I think he wrote it on like the 12th. And I read it and I just really, it's so bad I didn't care to respond or even really think about it too much. But I figure I thought about it today. I'm like, it's a perfect example of why talking to Stratton is such a headache in the first place and just very annoying. And I just want to explain what was going on with this. So I'm going to bring up my Facebook post that led to the question in the first place. I'm just going to pull it up on the screen. So this was from November 10th. I don't remember where I heard his argument in the first place, his free thinking argument. I think that's what it's called, right, Colton? I don't know.
Well, I mean, he has different versions of it.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly which one you responded to. It wasn't the free thinking argument. Maybe the deity of deception
Yeah,
argument.
it was that one. Yeah.
Um,
So I basically summed it up in saying, if you say that God determines all things and some believers have false theological beliefs, would that mean God determined them to believe false things and that makes God deceptive? And if you say yes to that, do you think, God determining Jesus to die on the cross, does that also make God a murderer? If you think God determined Pharaoh to harden his heart, does that make God cruel? God determined Assyria and Babylon to destroy Israel, does that make him a warmonger? Would all these premises have to be true or none? And if not, what's the difference between the first point and the others? And then I put an edit in here. That was the initial question. And then I put an edit the same day and I said, this is a question I'm asking Tim Stratton in response to his deity of deception argument, which holds the premise: if God determines all Christians to affirm false theological beliefs and God is deceptive, the Bible can't be trusted and Christians cannot have assurance in salvation. He said this one of the strongest premises in history of argumentation, which we already talked about in the last show. And I was basically like, I'm either really dumb or he's lying. So I'm asking the question since he doesn't have time to respond over Facebook. So I'm asking all of you guys for possible reasons he would believe this. So there's a good amount of comments. There's 57 comments, but pretty much everybody was like, I don't know what he's talking about. Like, I don't understand. But I didn't even think that was a good formulation of my question. I was kind of like off the top of my head. But this is what he pulled from to write his article that responded to me. And this is December 12th. This is 2 days over a month it took him to write this, where he pretty much restates my last part of the question. If you think God determined Jesus to die on a cross, does that make him a murderer? God determined Pharaoh to harden his heart, does that make him cruel? And so on. So he's like, good question. He's like, I'm guessing this is in response to my premise 2 of the deity of deception argument. Which, I mean, that's a great guess, Stratton, because I literally quoted it word for word right here in the article. So yes, your guess would be correct. I don't know how you figured that out because I was hiding it. Come on, dude. This is right off the bat. I'm annoyed. Why are you guessing that that's the premise I'm talking about? It's obviously the premise I'm talking about. Next thing that annoys me, it's in an argument that J.P. Moreland and I offered in our recent journal article, blah, 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 with our goal to show that it's ultimately self-defeating and for Christians who assume the Bible is theologically trustworthy. So he first says something that really annoys me, just some absolute tomfoolery, and then he follows it up by a name drop, which, if you ever listen to Stratton, I just dare you to try to hear him explain a point without mentioning somebody else's name. It's hilarious because he can't. He's incapable of doing it. Someone else also has to be involved.
Just mentioning something that he has in the works.
Yes.
Or that he has already done.
Exactly.
I mean, I get it. Like, he wants to promote it, and that's
yeah.
fine. Like,
And this is his website. It's his website.
Right.
That's what it's here for. which is fine. But I'm also annoyed because I explicitly tagged him in this post and I said he doesn't have time to respond over Facebook. So I'm asking all you guys, but he has time to write an entire article over it on his website in which I can't even interact with. There's no place to comment. There's no, like, it's just he puts it out there on the internet and it's just there without any scrutiny outside of me making a video about it. So anyways, I'm already annoyed. He restates his whole argument here. And then he spends the next 6 paragraphs restating his argument, right? Like, if you can read it if you want, I'm not going through this, but all this to show he doesn't even get to my question, which albeit was a pretty terrible question, which is why I rewrote it in a more cohesive question later on. But he spends, oh gosh, that's well over half of the article restating his original argument. So that to me is all fluff. Like, I don't care about that. And then he restates his initial argument in different terms, which takes up about another 25% of the article. And then at the very end, in the conclusion section, he actually somewhat answers my question. Still doesn't really, but somewhat answers it. But before we get to his great answer to my great question, I reposted this this question again on December 6th. So 6 days before he wrote this article, which pretty much I tagged him again, his name, I tagged the website and the article it came from, and I reposted the entire premise right here. So I said that my problem with is it leaves me with 3 options if all of these points are correct. And I even say, so point 2 is the point of contention for me, which I explicitly say here, which this came out, like I said, 6 days before he wrote the article. So he could have just used this to write about. I don't know why he didn't. And my 3 points were, if he's correct, that essentially leaves me with 3 options. God determines all things, and God is blameworthy for what he determines. Or God determines all things, but God is not blameworthy for what he determines. Or God doesn't determine all things. I can't think of another option, so if you can, let me know. Nobody else had any other options that they presented, and I have 238 comments on this, and nobody else knew what else to call it. It was pretty much one of those 3. I said, I know this doesn't apply to all theologians, but I know Tim, in all moldness, as far as I can tell, thinks that God does determine some things. Now, I may be wrong about that. I can guess at what particularly God determined, but for some things are clear to me, like Jesus dying on the cross, the earth being destroyed by flood, the firstborn of Egypt dying in the plague, Israel captured by Babylon, and Persia, just name a few. Things in scriptures God clearly had a hand in making happen. So if Tim agrees that these things were determined, then why is God not blameworthy for them too? That's essentially my question. So what's the difference? God's determining false beliefs makes him a liar, then why is God determined Jesus died on the cross and not make him a murderer? I'm restating my question. Do all scripture examples have exceptions that make it so God's not blameworthy for any of it? So the logic of premise 2 of Tim's argument taken to its logical conclusion, then God doesn't determine anything. Also, according to this point, it seems impossible that God determine something and not be blameworthy for it. Am I fair in rejecting point 2? Which the general consensus is yes. I'm fair in rejecting point 2, and that would, a lot of people would say that leads to God doesn't actually determine all things. Very few people thought God could determine all things and not be blameworthy for it. And some people said God determines all things and he is blameworthy for it. So it was a good mix, but most people were like, okay, this argument would lead that God doesn't determine all things. So it would be like, so Tim, does God not determine all things? Like, is that where this is kind of leading us? That's where I wanted him to answer the question. But here is his answer. To answer your questions, if I thought exhaustive determinism was true, it would be fair to refer to the deity of exhaustive determinism as cruel and a murderous warmonger. But since it's clearly false, God's perfect and maximal greatness is left unscathed. Be that as it may, if you disagree, and even if the deity determines a person to murder another person, whether the deity should not be referred to as a murderer. It has absolutely nothing to change the point of the deity deception argument, that the deity deception argument is not an attack on the deity of deception's character. It's attack on your epistemic, I don't know why I can't read this word, epistemological position to rationally affirm theological claims of knowledge. So that was his answer. Is one, it's not true, so no. And also, that wasn't the point of the argument. Are you as confused as I am, Colton?
I mean, I can see, because I've just studied Stratton pretty well, I can see where he's trying to say. He's saying that if he were to believe in Ed, that, exhaustive determinism is true, then he would have to say that, yes, God is cruel and a murderous warmonger and so forth. But I think he misses, so he answers the question a little bit, but the point is, your point specifically is God unjust, cruel, or a warmonger for all the things he's determined in the Bible? The intuitive answer is no.
Yeah.
So then transfer that to, Ed. Is God cruel and unjust, or
Yeah.
a warmonger? And the answer should again intuitively be no, which he doesn't understand.
Yeah.
But
And I wanted a quick note before you go on that I messaged Stratton a lot of different stuff. One was about being less abrasive in his description of Calvinism because I think it's just not helpful. And then I even told him, I'm going to post a question for you on Facebook. Not that you need to answer, but I'm looking forward to an answer if you can help me. And I was telling him I want to make my conversations with you very like direct and simple points and stick to one point and not veer away from it. Makes everything less time consuming. So I'm going to post a question. And this was on December 6th, which all it says is delivered. It doesn't say that he read it, but I posted the question right then after that on December 6th. I sent that message and then posted this question. And then 6 days later, he comes out with this argument or this article. But all that to say is I gave him every opportunity to look at what I was asking. And I like pleaded with him in the message, like, can we, like, I just want a direct answer, right? Like, I want in good faith, like, I'm going to make it as simple as I possibly can. What are your thoughts on this? Like, I actually really want to know. And then he posts this article. And
right.
I, like, can you just see, like, I'm like begging for like a coherent argument that actually answers my question, like something. Like, what are your thoughts on this? Like, do you not actually think God determines anything in the Bible? Like, that's what I would want him to say. Because then I'd be like, well, you're not really a Molinist then, if you think that. And he was like, oh, well, God did determine those things in the Bible to happen, but he's not blameworthy for it. And I'm just like, okay, so why is he not blameworthy for that, but blameworthy
Right.
if people have false ideas? And we could
Which
go through and he can probably give me an answer like, oh, well, there's this reason in the Old Testament, in this passage, and this reason here, and this reason here. We'd have to go through every single thing that we both determined that God determined in the Old Testament and explain why he's not blameworthy there, but he would be blameworthy for having people hold false ideas about him.
right. So I've already told you I don't usually like using Pharaoh's example just
Yeah.
because they could say that Pharaoh was non-derivatively responsible or directly free,
Or started
and
it because he first
he
hardened his heart,
started
and
his
all of this was a
hardness of heart. Yeah. Um, now
was
I
a
know you may
punishment.
disagree, or other Calvinists disagree, or whatever, but the other example is like the crucifixion. To me, is like foolproof. So like God absolutely determined the crucifixion. He determined that he would save mankind by sending his own son to die on the cross. Now, that is consistent with whatever atonement view I think you offer, whether it's Christus Victor or penal substitutionary, like it doesn't matter. Whatever atonement view you have, I think it's still safe to say God determined that Jesus would die on the cross. And yet, Jesus did it A, on his own free will, and B, God's not blameworthy for it. he's actually praiseworthy for that determination. And so that to me shows God's determination and his goodness are compatible. So God's determination of evil and his goodness of it, his omnibenevolence is still secured. Those two things are not mutually exclusive; they are compatible.
Yeah.
And so I agree with you. I think Stratton, or any non-Calvinist for that matter, ought to, concede that yes, God can determine some things and yet still be praiseworthy for it. Um, and if they don't concede that, then they have to show exactly what makes the crucifixion relevantly different than just normal, I dare say, lesser evils. Just because the crucifixion, if you're a Christian at least, that's the most horrific evil.
Yeah.
And so um, it's really an a fortiori argument that I have yet to see answered from non or indeterminists, I guess.
Yeah. And to me, I'm like, this is not like a checkmate gotcha like scenario.
Right.
This is okay, if you want to have this argument hold, you need to be clear on what the implications are. So if it is that, you know, you have to concede to me that God did determine some things if you're a Molinist. We start there. So Tim,
Right.
if you're watching this video, did God determine things in the Old Testament? Yes or no? Okay. So if we get that answer and the answer is yes, then what are the relevant differences between what God determines in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament compared to God determining someone today to have false theological
Awesome.
beliefs? We have
Right.
to go through them.
Now he does say at the end, to be fair, that the argument has nothing to do with the deity's character. So like
Yeah.
God's character underneath determinism. So he says that in the last sentence in the first paragraph of the conclusion of the article.
Yeah.
So the deity deception argument is not an attack against the deity of Ed's character, which means he's not trying to show a compatibility, or rather, for his argument, an incompatibility of God determining all things and yet God also being blameworthy for false theological beliefs. And honestly, I mean, I get that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I get it. He's mainly saying, and that's the other phrase there, that's an attack against the determined agent's epistemic position
Yeah.
to rationally affirm. Now, let's just go with that then. Okay. God determined Christ on the cross. Yes, okay. He determined Christ on the cross. Is he, aside from his character, whether or not he's praiseworthy or blameworthy for it, God, whether he's praiseworthy or blameworthy for determining Christ to be crucified on the cross, think about the agent who's determined Christ. Okay. Was he free to go to the cross?
Yes.
If the answer is yes, then that's compatibilism. If the answer is no, which good luck trying to defend that, because I think uh, the vast majority of Christian Orthodox will say he did it voluntarily.
Well,
Then if the
exhaustive
answer is no,
determinism would say that he was forced to go.
well, hard determinism would say that he was forced to go, right?
Determinism is determinism, Stratton would say, as he has said to me.
So dumb.
I know.
But the idea is yes or no, was he free? And
Yeah.
you have to say, I think, yes, he was free. He was reasons responsive. He knew what he was doing. He wanted to do it, and
Yeah.
he had good reason to do it. He, to me, had guidance control, which is
Yep.
compatible with determinism. And so he had guidance control as a human agent, and yet we still count him as free. Now, I do not think the incompatibilist, or Stratton here, can say the same. And if he says no, he's not free, then I guess he's consistent with the DOD, deity of deception argument. But I don't see how anyone could reject the fact that he wasn't free while going to the cross. And as
Yeah.
soon as they say, oh yeah, he was free, though God determined it, okay, take that same idea, transfer it to the deity of deception argument. Are we free, though God has determined us to do false theological things? So that is epistemically bad,
Yeah.
is what Stratton's mind says. Well, sending an innocent man to a cross is kind of, I don't know, morally bad, it seems. So that's the idea should transfer over. And I don't think that's what you wanted to convey in your in your response, but
Yeah.
or your question,
And
but
maybe I
he didn't
wasn't
get
clear, and I'm not saying I'm not, I know I'm not good at this stuff. But I at least thought I feel like I checked all the boxes, like I crossed my T's and dotted my I's to get some type of coherent question to elicit a coherent response. And what I got was just fluff. Like it's just more of the same with him. And that's and I read that article and I'm just like I don't care that he wrote this. Like I don't want to respond to it. Like I had no emotional reaction to it aside from just being like slightly disappointed. Just like,
it.
okay, again, like my freaking 3-year-old peed his pants again. Like it was like that kind of like, really? I don't know. It and and what I want to say too is he says like, oh, this is just about the uh how do you say that word? I want to say
Epistemic.
epis, epistemic.
Yeah,
Okay,
epistemic.
epistemic. He wants to say, oh, it's about the epistemic. Um,
The
I forgot how
epistemic
to,
position of the agent
of the
being
agent.
determined.
Okay, cool. Like that's the whole point, is to get you, you can't be confident in your own beliefs. But the way that the question is formed, especially in premise 2, saying that it would make God deceptive, which would make his word like not true, and would you can't be sure of your salvation. Those are all value judgments against God's
Mhm.
character. And if you're making value judgments
Yeah,
against God's character, that's when you start saying things like his word isn't faithful or trustworthy, and salvation can't be trustworthy
yeah, it's interesting.
because of a value judgment on God's character. It's like, okay, if this is true, then I can call God deceptive. And if God is deceptive, then you have the whole list down the line. So we're not talking about epistemological ability or source or like how you can believe what you want or believe what you believe as an agent and be confident in that. It's attacking our confidence in God, in our theological framework, by making character judgments based on how he understands determinism. So it's a sleight of hand in my book. That's how I see it. Is like, oh, you're
Yeah,
saying you're attacking my epistemological sources or ability or confidence, but the way you get there is by attacking God's character by calling him deceptive in the first place.
yeah. So I think I've talked to him about this before, and I usually posit something like intentions. God has good intentions when he determines things. So that doesn't necessarily, even though the consequence is my false theological belief, that doesn't necessarily backfire into the consequent of premise 2, which is God is therefore then untrustworthy. And he says that it's not about God's intentions, it's about the epistemic position of the agent. But the problem is, premise 4 is literally about God's character.
Exactly.
So there's never reason to doubt God's inspired word. Now, premise 2, the consequence of it, I think, entails that it's about the agent's epistemic position. Um, or the general conclusion of the whole argument entails the epistemic position of the agent to call into question that. But how you call into question the epistemic position of the agent being determined is by understanding how God determines,
Exactly.
which
That's
then backfires into his character.
exactly.
So if you know that God can determine in a trustworthy way, well, then the argument fails. But newsflash, compatibilist determinists do say that God determines in a trustworthy way by aiming at truth through moderate reasons responsiveness, by tracking evidence, all this fun junk. Yes, it's all determined. Yes, it's about God's will, but it is through a mechanism which leads to evidence. That is trustworthy. And if that's trustworthy and reliable, then God can be trustworthy and reliable. So premise 2 is false. So,
Yeah,
what
and
do
I
you?
really feel like it's as simple as that. Like, uh, this whole argument falls apart like that. But if you said that to his face, he would literally be like, the mechanisms don't matter.
No,
He doesn't
I think that's just
understand that the mechanisms make it different than the way he's describing it.
and he doesn't understand this because the mechanism technically Molinism is a mechanism. So the
Exactly.
way God determines Molinism or the way God actualizes a world in Molinism is weakly actualizing it. What that means is that mechanism of him weakly actualizing is choosing a world in which libertarian free creatures would do this or that. That is a mechanism that God utilizes in bringing about the world. Okay, so Molinists themselves believe that differing mechanisms matter because they also believe, well, if God strongly actualized, not weakly, but strongly actualized the world, aka determined the world, then agents would not be morally responsible and free. Now we reject that because we make even more distinctions between strong actualization mechanisms. There's a way to strongly actualize something that still determines the outcome, but yet eradicates the human agent, like manipulation or something like that. But they just lump all Molinists usually critique determinists because they lump all strong actualization mechanisms all in one vote.
Yes.
And that's the problem. So my point is, even Molinists have to say that there's differing mechanisms that God can utilize in order to uh, in order to ensure appropriate freedom within the creatures. Great. Afford us the same privilege, and we'll have a deal.
Yeah.
But they never do. So that's
it
the unfortunate
it's
part.
so crazy if you think about the different ways like me and you talk about these problems and try to explain our positions as opposed to how Tim goes about it. Like it even like watching your thing with Tim, what was his name? Is his name Tim? The
Tyler, Tyler,
Fowler? Tyler?
yeah.
Tyler, that's what it was. Like and I was watching his video and every time they had Stratton come on to like talk about his position or explain his position, it really feels like he's talking to me like he's trying to sell me a car. I cannot shake that feeling. And that's like the very first thing I saw from this guy. That was what did I say? It was like he's a salesman. He's a popcorn theologian. Like he's like peddling snake oil, like trying to pull the wool over my eyes is what it feels like. And I just inherently don't trust the way that he like talks about these things. And I feel like he's using it. Like the reason I feel like that is because he doesn't actually know what he's talking about most of the time. So he's kind of BSing his way through it
Right.
and trying to make very complicated very like things that you need to read and study on for a long time in order to get a good handle on, like the compatibilist view. And he hasn't done that. So he tries to convince you that it's simpler than it actually is. And then he
It's not.
argues his own simple version that he made up in his own head and attacks that and thinks he has the greatest premise in the history of argumentation. Really, he's fighting Ghost. Like, I don't know, dude.
Yeah, I think
It
it's very
makes me mad.
obvious if you put, and I mean this with love and respect because I would say he's a Christian and he's a brother.
Of
But
course.
at the same time, I'm going to say if you put my argumentation alongside of his, even on podcasts, it's very obvious, I think, who cites what. I mean, in the last podcast I did, I cited many, many different people with page
Oh,
numbers and the year
hold
that they
on.
came out. Like,
So it
Stratton does none of that.
in his response he says, uh, Paul Helm says, quote, every twist and turn, quote, of our thoughts are under God's direct or under the direct control of God. So the only thing Paul Helm said was every twist and turn. That was the end of the quote. So Stratton adds, of our thoughts are direct under direct control of God. What? How? Okay, what did Paul Helm actually say after he said every twist and turn, right? Okay, let me look at the sources. Where did he cite Paul Helm's quote? It's not on here. I have to take your word for it that every twist and turn, what he actually meant by that is every twist and turn of our thoughts are under direct control of God. Paul Helm said that word for word, at least the first part of it. He said those first 4 words, so that he must have meant that whole thing. That was another thing that pissed me off. Thank you for reminding me of that. Just wanted to show the readers that. And if there is a citation of where that quote came from, please tell me where. Stratton, please What are you talking about? Where did Paul Helm say that? And why did you only use 4 words out of his entire phrase that I'm sure did
Right.
not say that in the slightest? Again, pulling wool over my eyes, selling me snake oil. There's reasons I think this, Stratton, because you do stuff like
I
that. And I don't
I
know if you're
think
being facetious or if you're careless. Either way, it is hurting the overall discussion about these things. It really is.
yeah. So when I went on the last podcast with Faith Unaltered, I was just not going to quote the quotes from Kane, Tempe, and Van Inwagen, and I was just going to mention them kind of like in passing. And then one of the hosts actually encouraged me to find the exact quotes, and actually like write them down and cite them because it would be helpful for readers. And I'm like, you know what? It's kind of annoying, but I'm going to do it anyways, and it is helpful. That is not, by the way, the only time Stratton has miscited something, or didn't cite anything at
I
all,
don't know if it's a
and it's
miscite because
unfortunate.
it's not cited.
Right. So I think the level of rigor and the homework that needs to be done to like on free thinking ministries end is astronomical. I think you can't be in these debates, and especially when people actually take it extremely seriously, like people are actually struggling with whether or not free will or determinism rule out freedom, or is it incompatible with freedom, what's Molinism, all these fun things. When it comes to his own views, he's going to cite them pretty regularly. Like if it comes to Craig, he's going to cite it. If it comes to Moreland, he's going to cite it. But when it comes to like Guillaume Bignon, or if it comes to Sartario, or if it comes to like Paul Helm, compatibilists, where's the citation?
Don't
And
know.
it just makes for an awful interlocutor experience. Like we're trying to double check his work and everything and see whether or not it's correct. And we can't. So we have to take his word for it. We should make a deity of Stratton argument, uh, or Stratton of deity argument, or
Well,
deception or something argument.
like these are the things that Stratton
If you
does.
don't cite your premise, the premise one is if you don't cite your stuff, how are we supposed to keep you as a trustworthy source for these matters? So
Exactly.
you don't cite your stuff, so you're not trustworthy.
And I say all of this to basically convince myself and hopefully even convince you, Colton, that this there's reasons why Prosciutto backed out of the argument or the debate with Stratton. There's reasons why Bignon is just not. He's like, I've wrote my response to his stuff and read his rejoinder and just shook his head and is like, I'm not dealing with this guy anymore. Like there are reasons.
Yeah.
Like me, like I don't know. I'm dumb enough to like be frustrated by it, but the guys that's smarter than me and you are smart enough to realize that it's a lost cause and that it's really there's you're arguing with someone who speaks a different language than you essentially. And that's why it feels so taxing and frustrating and like constantly
Right.
like missing the point over and over and over again. Because I feel like I can
Yeah.
have discussions with dudes like Chappa, if that's how you say his name, Will Duffy, uh, all sorts of people that don't agree with me. There's another dude, Christian Halls, like these guys in the debate group, smart people. Like most of the smartest people in our thread that we are in on Facebook, our group on Facebook, don't agree with us. But I can talk to them and it's a really good discussion. Oh, Jenny also always has really good points. But when it comes to Stratton, it's not that. It turns into something else, and I don't know. Let's move on. I spent way too much time on that. I did not want to do that. Um, I wanted to get to what you wanted to talk about. So I don't know. I know it's foreknowledge and Frankfurt style cases. That's it.
Right.
Which I have been getting
So
through Prosciutto's book. Is that how you say it?
Preciado.
Preciado. Sorry, Prosciutto sounds like a cheese. Preciado's book. So I know a little
Prosciutto.
bit. I'm getting through like I'm to the part where he introduces moderate
Uh,
reasons responsiveness instead of strong or weak. So
right. Yeah. First of all, yeah, Preciado is a great author. I think um, he does really well, and he knows Fisher Revise's like stuff, guidance control extremely well. So I think it's a good book. And honestly, I used that book, the first two chapters, just to like summarize their huge theory of moral responsibility. Like because he summarizes it in 60 pages, and they spent like 230 pages articulating the view in their 1998 book, Responsibility and Control. And Preciado does an excellent job summarizing it in 60 pages,
yeah.
which is awesome. So I think whenever I need like a refresher on something, or how do I phrase this, I always go to Preciado's book actually, because he summarizes it extremely well, and he has
Hmm.
commentary, which is always nice to like get the view, what Fish and Revisa say, then the commentary afterwards, and then you can put it in your own words. It's just really good. So I love that book. So let me know if you have questions or when you finish it. But Frankfurt style examples. So I guess I didn't really have a lot planned, but what I would want to do is kind of explain Frankfurt style examples, because we've kind of been dancing around them here and there in different episodes, what the motivation is for Frankfurt style examples, and then also show how I think determinist ought or compatibilist ought to use Frankfurt style examples, what's wrong with them, what's not wrong with them, and then finally I want to do two applications for it. So one of them is to show sourcehood, and then the other one is to show its relation to foreknowledge. And there's a foreknowledge argument that I'm just now getting into. It's not mine, but it's John Martin Fisher's argument. And it's a really, really good argument, I think. It's a solid argument that has a good foundation in the philosophical literature, and I love it. Like, it's really good. So before we get into it, I'd just like to say that the argument, though, is an incompatibility argument of divine foreknowledge and human libertarian freedom. So, in other words, God cannot know what libertarian free creatures will do or would do, if you're a Molinist, in the future. So he doesn't actually know what they would or will do in the future, unless I say, determinists say, Calvinists say, usually, unless he determines it. So he has to determine the truth value in order for him to know what the value is. And so that's kind of the framework. What do you think?
Prove it. I don't know. Show me. I mean, do you want me to like the whole like outline or just what
No,
you
no, no.
said?
Yeah, is this like, is that good? Do you think we can cover all that in one
I mean, probably
episode?
not. Depending on how long you want to talk, but or how concise we can be. I will say to start off, I know that the goal, correct me if I'm wrong, of Frankfurt style cases is to show that the what is it called, the principle of alternative possibilities, or PAP, um, is not necessary in order to uphold freedom. That's what Frankfurt style cases are trying to show, essentially.
To uphold moral responsibility.
Responsibility,
Oh,
freedom. Are they
you
really
had it.
much different? Are they really that different?
Honestly, yes. And that sucks, but
Okay,
it is
so show moral that PAP isn't needed for moral responsibility.
right.
Yeah.
So that's the goal. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read a basic Frankfurt style example, and then we can talk about more complicated Frankfurt style examples, how usually what incompatibilists like to say about them, different, I guess, avenues a incompatibilist could say about Frankfurt style examples, and then what I think the compatibilist should say about them. And then afterwards, hopefully, if we have time, I want to get into its applications to agency, number one, and then number two, foreknowledge.
feel like
So
I'm about to
sounds
take
good.
a college class. Let me get comfortable real quick. All right, go ahead.
No, I think you had it right on the money for Frankfurt. So here's just one classic example of a Frankfurt style example. It was popularized by Harry Frankfurt in 1969. He wrote like a 10-page essay and kind of put it in historical stuff. Back then, the compatibility and incompatibility debate really revolved around like classical compatibilism, which is basically like I could do this if I wanted to do this. As like a conditional sort of sense. That's what Bignon uses a lot. And a lot of people at that time just thought in the early 60s that was bogus. And they kind of thought that it was dead, like classical compatibilism was dead. And honestly, in the early 60s, almost to the late 60s, incompatibilism was like the go to. Like everyone thought incompatibilism was pretty much solid, except for a few philosophers. Then Harry Frankfurt came in, blew everyone's brains out with this 10-page article that now we're still discussing freaking 60, 50 years later. So his basic argument goes like this. Imagine a man whose brain was secretly implanted with electrodes by this mad scientist. The scientist, being a supporter of, let's just say, politician X, decides that he will activate the electrodes to make the man vote for politician X. If the man goes into the polling booth to vote for, let's just say, politician Y. So, on the other hand, if the man chooses to vote for politician X, then the scientist will not activate the electrodes. Why? Because the scientist wants the agent to vote for X. Then the scientist will not activate the electrodes. But suppose then the man goes into the polling booth and presses the button to vote for politician X. In such a case, it seems that the man freely votes for X. He is responsible for the vote. So what does this mean? It means this. Let's just say I go into the booth. I want to vote for, I don't know, Trump. Let's just say I have Trump and Biden. So I go in, this mad scientist who secretly implants an electrode in my brain wants me to vote for Trump. But in the actual sequence of events, I actually do vote for Trump. So does the mad scientist have to do anything with my brain? The answer is no, because I already vote for Trump on my own in the actual sequence of events. Now, in the alternative scenario, let's just say I don't vote for Trump. Let's just say I try to vote for Biden. Then the counterfactual intervener or the mad scientist is going to come in, switch the nozzle. I kind of zap me into submission. I then, vote for Republican or Trump. Now, the question is, can I, the agent in the story, do otherwise? Well, it just seems like in both scenarios, I still vote for Republican. So can I do otherwise other than vote Republican? And it seems like no, but then it also seems like am I morally responsible for voting Republican in the actual sequence of events? Frankfurt says yes. So Frankfurt style examples, huge, huge, huge thing in the literature, and they're still going on today. What are the problems? So there's a couple problems. First, it's called the flicker of freedom problem. And the flicker of freedom problem says that, well, you're right. I couldn't in the actual sequence of, or in the whole scenario, I couldn't do otherwise, but I could try to do otherwise. So that means I could try to vote Democrat, and then once I try to vote Democrat, then the counterfactual intervener zaps me, and then I vote Republican instead. And the idea is, right, Harry Frankfurt, you're right in the fact that maybe I couldn't do other than vote Republican, but I could try to vote Democrat. And that trying is a flicker. And then if that is the case, that could plausibly ground my responsibility, which is to say that I do have an alternative possibility residing in the Frankfurt story. And if I do have an alternative possibility residing in the Frankfurt story, well, then, Frankfurt fails. PAP is still true. The reason why I'm morally responsible is because I could have tried to do otherwise, not because I just did it on my own. The idea of Frankfurt is really this idea of sourcehood. and leeway. So we talked about it before. Sourcehood being like I do something on my own, and then leeway being like alternative possibilities. So he tries to juxtapose those views and say, hey, free will has more to do with you being the source of your actions and less to do with you having alternative possibilities. Some people like to fight that and try to say, no, alternative possibilities are still there. In fact, it doesn't matter if you're compatibilist or incompatibilist. If you're a believer in leeway, you could attack Frankfurt's argument technically. So that's the general idea of Frankfurt, and that's the number one um, argument probably against it. Um, what do you think? Do you have anything to add?
Well, when you said the flicker of freedom, that's where my head instantly went. Is like, well, what if, like, there's, the scenario where the mad scientist didn't have to do anything because the person chose to vote
Right,
Republican. But if they wanted to vote Democrat, then he would have to activate his mechanism, which would then force you to vote Republican. So the outcome doesn't change. It seems like the difference between the two is the desire of the agent,
right,
because
right,
in this scenario there'd have to be something that prompts the scientists to be like, oh crap, they're not choosing what I want. So I don't know if that's the hand reaching out, or like they're just about to check Democrat, and then at that point, so it's like all of those actions from, you know, the reasons those desires are there in the first place, to whatever the agent does just for the small amount of time before the mechanism kicks in. That
right,
shows, at least to me, that I would still say that you don't have alternative possibilities. I wouldn't say that, but I would say that that would make it so that the agent is not morally responsible for choosing Republican, because their desire was so clearly and obviously to vote Democrat. In that at
right,
that point, I would say that they were coerced and forced to vote Republican, which I
right.
would say, alternative possibilities out the window, but moral responsibility is still intact. What is so? I don't know if I'm in the ballpark here, but that's kind of what it seems like to me.
Yeah, and honestly, I think that's what more or less what I would conclude. Um, so what's the problem? I think. So yeah, you have these flickers of freedom. The agent, let's just call him Jones in the Frankfurt story, could simply try or begin or will, Democrat rather than Republican. And then we want to say that, okay, he's morally responsible or not morally responsible because of that willing. Now, the fact is, everyone agrees in the alternative sequence in which the counterfactual intervener, the mad scientist, I think it's me. Let me close out of this. Um,
Popular guy.
so hopefully, we won't get any more dings. It may have been me. I don't know. But I closed some tabs. But everyone agrees that the counterfactual intervener is in that action and the alternative sequence in which he forces you to do otherwise. Everyone agrees the agent is not morally responsible.
Okay.
So the issue with Frankfurt style examples is holding fixed, they say. Literally, they literally use that language, holding fixed the actual sequence. What that means is they hold fixed the sequence in which Jones, the agent, does in fact choose the same thing that the counterfactual intervener wants them to choose. In that sequence, we see freedom. Okay, that's what they want to try to argue. But I agree with you that I think the flicker is pretty big here. That they could still try to do other than vote, Republican. They could try to vote Democrat, and once they try to vote Democrat, then the alternative sequence kicks in, and then they, vote Republican because of the counterfactual intervener. So I think the original formulation of Frankfurt style arguments do fail for
Yes.
this
And
reason.
okay, I want to throw
Yeah.
this at you really quickly too. So in order for it to not fail, you would pretty much have to say that every single action that Jones takes would be in line with the will of the scientist. Every single point. If you want to
Right.
talk about actual sequence, and if we want,
Right.
maybe in his thing, it was just talking about elections. But if we want to take that application to God and we say that God determines all things, I mean, all things would have to be in line with what Jones does is within the will of God, which we would say obviously that's not true. But if you want to say, well, all things Jones does is determined by God, you, I guess, could argue that and have it still hold. So I think that there is instances, though, at least in the Bible, where the desire or will of the person actually gets overridden by I would call it the Holy Spirit. Like,
Yeah.
the disciples after, was it Pentecost, get you know the Holy Spirit comes upon them, and Peter
Oh,
gets
Pentecost.
Pentecost, that's what it's called. And Peter gets inspired, has that awesome sermon. To me, that is not what necessarily Peter like entirely decided, like left to Peter's own desires outside of God acting on them with the Holy Spirit would have been different. So I do see points where, if you want to keep the analogy, where the scientist does in fact override
Right.
the agent, and I would say that that mechanism in the Bible could be the Holy Spirit, like, because I think the Holy
I
Spirit,
don't know if I would necessarily say it overrides their character because
see it
Peter's sermon is still in line
with
with
what he does
his knowledge
believes.
and his character.
But would that, when you say desire, it doesn't have to be like, or overrides, like those two are,
I think, yeah, so I think overriding the character means circumventing their agency, circumventing their reasons for doing what they do at that time. So that means they would do what they do regardless of their actual reasons issuing, let's just say, to vote Republican or
yeah.
to preach an awesome
Well,
sermon.
just forget about
I
Peter
think,
for a second. Paul.
what about
Paul
Paul?
Paul was a murderer of Christians, obviously against it,
Right,
persecuting the church. And God literally came in and was like, no, like,
right.
you're going to be a believer. I think that's probably a better example. Like God showing himself to Paul, to
Oh,
where I
okay,
would
okay.
say that, and that's an instance to me of God coming in, and you don't have to say overriding, but if you want to keep the analogy, that would be the scientist flipping a switch. God did that in Paul's
Right.
life in a very
I would just I would disagree.
obvious way.
Here's why. And the
Okay.
only reason why I disagree is because I think we need to secure sourcehood really substantially, whether you're an incompatibilist or a compatibilist. And I think regeneration is a sticky topic where you want to say that you were a murderer before conversion and then you're not one after because now you're a believer. So it seems on first glance, God has determined you to salvation and has overridden, in some sense, your own sinful agency to make it a new agency, one that, can be endowed to righteousness, whatever. Is that kind of the idea you're thinking here?
Well, when you say override, like I think of the idea of like repentance, which is you're going one direction and you turn around and start heading in a
Right,
different direction. So when I say
right.
override, like that's what I mean. You're changing directions. So left to
Oh,
your
okay.
own
So,
devices on your own outside of God's influence, Paul would have continued down that road. Peter maybe would have stayed fearful and, in the mindset he was when he rejected, Christ or whatever. Like, we don't know exactly what that would look like because God, you could say, empowered their desires to love him. But in either way, he's still, the act of repentance of changing directions is what I'm referring to. So to me, I see that's very similar to like when I'm hearing the Frankfurt style case and the scientist flipping the switch and making someone go from Democrat to Republican. I see similarities with that for God flipping the switch on people who are sinners headed to hell to becoming Christians. I'm not saying they're the same, but I'm saying that I see similarities there, which would make me think that there are instances where it's not always the case that in the actual sequence that the agent is choosing to do what the scientist is also desiring them to do, which is what the Frankfurt people would want to say.
So, and I think I understand. I would still disagree only because I think we have different definitions of what it means to override.
Yeah.
So, your idea of overriding, just repentance, could just be still in the actual sequence of events. What I mean by overriding is something antithetical or mutually exclusive to the agent's actual reasons for doing what they do. So even in the actual sequence, Jones has reasons for why he votes Republican and not Democrat. He follows those reasons. The scientist never intervenes.
So
In the
in our
Christian scenario, I could say even Paul had reasons to become Christian.
obviously
He
became
became
blind.
Christian.
Yeah, he was
What?
blinded. He was blinded by the
Right.
Holy
So,
Spirit. Like God
and
spoke
I
to
don't
him.
know, Jesus came on the road to Damascus, blinded.
Yeah, maybe
That's a good
that's a
reason.
good reason. Yeah. And then Peter
So that's
like
I would
getting engulfed with the Holy Spirit and seeing like the flame on the wall and like all of the experiences with talking with Jesus for those 40 days. Those are really good reasons
right.
for him to produce the kind of sermon that he had. So they might have not been
Right.
from originating with the agent. Like those reasons were not reasons that they came up with out of thin air of their own making. It was in response to outside factors, which is still okay. Reasons don't have to be reasons in your own head. They could be reasons because of circumstances changing.
Right. And as long as they have reasons that the agent in the actual sequence is reasons responsive in a moderate way, then they can control what they do. I'd like to equate this to like the spirit kind of lifts up those people. So like I would say the spirit did lift up Peter during that sermon. And by lifting up, obviously, we mean spiritual and metaphorical and so forth, right? And I think in our own life, we can kind of tell if you're a believer for any amount of time, there's seasons in your life in which you just feel kind of lifted. Like you
Mm-hmm.
don't feel like you're just kind of being carried through your life and the spirit's like kind of taking control. Maybe during the summer when you met Susie, right? Those decisions that you made were just so perfect and you just kind of felt kind of grafted and lifted through that season in a beautiful way, and it ended up that you guys were together. That I would still contend is the actual sequence of events, and so because you were responsive to reasons all the way through that sequence, even though the spirit was lifting you up all the way through your decisions to marry her, not to marry her, and where to be married, all that fun junk. Does that make sense?
Yes, they're still in line with my desires. Much you could say similar to Pharaoh and his hardening of heart. Maybe God hardened my heart to Susie. I don't know if you want to call it a spirit filled. It's a very loose analogy, but um, all that to
Right.
say is that it's still in line with my desires. It's not contrary to what I would desire. In a different way to say it, it's not contrary to my reasons. I have very good reasons to like Susie, and maybe the
Yeah,
spirit made
that's what
that
I want.
more
That's what I
apparent
would
to
like to.
me and more steadfast in that conviction. But the reasons don't change, you know.
Right. So I think that's the key here. Is Jones in the actual sequence reasons responsive, or is he not? Now, there's tons of debate on it, obviously, and I think compatibilists are generally going to say, yeah, he is reasons responsive to alternative reasons, even though he couldn't do otherwise, or because of hardcore Frankfurt style examples, which we'll get to in a bit, he couldn't even think otherwise. He is still reasons responsive in the dispositional agential sense, at least necessary for his responsibility. And I could apply that to any action, all actions, for human life, specifically even a Christian life. So I think that's like the general framework of Frankfurt style arguments now, or Frankfurt style counterexamples. They're not really arguments, but they're counterexamples to PAP. Um, I do think Frankfurt's original formulation fails. So because of the flicker of freedom to do otherwise, Jones could try to vote Republican or Democrat, let's just say. But are there Frankfurt examples that get pushed more into the mental capacity of the agent? The answer is yes, which is what makes these so scientifically fun and kind of sci-fi-ish, because you can actually push that counterfactual mechanism so far back into the agent, which they start to eliminate all these flickers pretty fast. So I'll give you another Frankfurt style example. It's pretty complicated, so I'm going to read it if that's okay. But it's pretty complicated. Great example, and it kind of shows you how sci-fi these can get. So this one's from Eleanor Stump. She created in 1996, republished it with some revisions in 2003, and I call it. She calls it also G. So G. Suppose that a neurosurgeon, Gray, wants his patient Jones to vote Republican in the upcoming election. Gray has a neuroscope which lets him both observe and bring about neural firings which correlate with acts of will on Jones's part. Through his neuroscope, Gray can ascertain every time Jones wills to vote for Republican candidates, not just to do or vote for Republican, but will to vote Republican. That act of his will correlates with completion of a sequence of a certain neural firing. It's kind of interesting here. So what does that mean? So near the beginning of Jones's willing to vote Republican, his neurons, Stumps stipulates, is ABC. So his neuron fires A, B, C, and then at the completion of that neural firing, he wills to vote Republican. Okay. On the other hand, Jones's willing to vote for Democrat candidates is correlated with a different completion of different neural sequences. Near its beginning, the firings of neurons XYZ, not ABC, but XYZ, none of which is the same of those neuron sequences ABC. So let's call the ABC, Stump says, that neuron firing, let's call that sequence R for Republican, because if Jones's neurons start ringing ABC in his mind, then he's going to vote Republican at the end of the sequence. Okay, let's say XYZ is Democrat, because at the end of XYZ, Jones is going to vote Democrat. Okay, so for simplicity's sake, let's just say that the neural sequence R nor the neural sequence D is correlated with any other mental acts. All right, so here's the story. That was just a setup. Here's the story. Okay, this is how complicated it can get, and I love it so much. So Gray can tune his neuroscope, the counterfactual intervener, the mad scientist Gray, can tune his neuroscope accordingly. Whenever the neuroscope detects the firing of XYZ, so that's R, that's D, the initial neurons of sequence D, the neuroscope immediately disrupts the neural sequence. Why? Because Gray wants Jones to vote Republican, of course, so that it isn't brought to a completion. So Jones never actually votes Democrat. The neuroscope then activates the coercive neurological mechanism, which fires the neurons of neural sequence R, thereby bringing it about that Jones wills to vote for Republicans. Not to vote Republicans, but to will to vote Republicans. So it's all in the mind. It's not like any action at all here. But if the neuroscope detects the firing of ABC, so R, which is correlated with the act of will to vote for Republicans, then the neuroscope does not interrupt the neural sequence. That's the actual sequence of events. It doesn't activate the coercive neurological mechanism, and the neural sequence R continues, just like it normally would, culminating in Jones's willing to vote Republicans without Jones's being caused to will in this way by Gray. So, if this happens, what do we say? Stump concludes that Jones is morally responsible for voting Republican, even though Jones couldn't even will to vote Democrat. Complicated example. Do you understand it?
Yeah.
Right. So the idea is Frankfurt's original. Its problem was that Jones could actually try to do or to vote a physical action, could actually physically vote Democrat. Flicker of freedom, so it fails. But here the problem is, okay, well now Jones can't even will to vote Democrat. So it's not that he doesn't even have a physical action available to him to vote Democrat. He will always, no matter what, vote Republican physically. Even mentally, he will always will to vote Republican.
You could
So
say
it
it. Any
pushes it back into the mind.
any like changes in his desire to, vote Democrat, um, the changes from that to Republican, he wouldn't even be consciously aware of it, essentially.
Right, right,
So
exactly. Because
yeah,
Stump says the neural sequence has to complete.
yeah.
So when the neural sequence has completed, that's when Jones wills to vote Democrat or Republican. But if the neuroscientist Gray sees that Jones's neural firings are doing XYZ, so Democrat, and this is even unbeknownst to Jones at all, then he'll do the actual or the alternative sequence, manipulate Jones into voting Republican, so ABC, and then at the end of C, that's when Jones is like, I will to vote Republican, and that's when Jones actually does vote Republican. So the idea about Frankfurt examples is they're so fun to me. I'm kind of geeking out a little bit because they push it so back into the mental substrate that it eradicates all these physical flickers of freedom. So did we solve it? Is it path finished now? Is Jones morally responsible? Um, I think not, because here's why. There's still flicker in the actual sequence. Maybe you could say, well, Colton, I don't understand. He couldn't vote Democrat at all. He can only vote Republican. Right. But as Tempe says, and Tempe is a good successor of Stump, I think, and he critiques her view, her case. He says Jones can still, um, throughout his libertarian free will, through alternative possibilities, he could still choose how to will to vote Republican. So he can choose how to will to vote Republican in this way. He could choose to how to
Oh,
will to vote Republican in this way. He could choose how to will to vote Republican in that way. And that, although he can never choose to will to vote for Democrat, he can only choose to will to vote Republican. But he still has in his libertarian freedom this idea, this indeterministic freedom, this flicker of freedom that says I can choose how to will to vote Republican. And so there's maybe if you imagine like he's in the booth in the actual sequence, he's voting for Republican because he has to, Gray standing on the sidelines. But maybe as he's circling it, maybe he puts an X on the Republican stand, right? Instead of doing the little bubble. Well, that's still voting Republican, right? That's still willing to vote Republican. Or maybe he does a little bubble instead. Maybe he circles it. All those different ways are he's still willing to vote Republican. That doesn't change. But the mode, how he's willing to vote Republican is changing. And that is still within the agent, and that's still flicker. And Tempe says that still shows Frankfurt to fail in some way. What do you
is it
think?
because if you ran that experiment like 100 times, in theory, given these specific and frankly outlandish circumstances, it could
Yeah.
be that the outcomes, just the way he votes, is different. Not each time, but there's going to be a variety in outcomes. just we call it stylistic differences,
Right.
which means that he does have alternative possibilities. Yeah, no, I get it.
Right.
Now I'm afraid
And
of where it's going now.
no, I just have one more example, but
Okay.
I think but this is a good example to show that okay, you can really push them so far back in the mental substrate of the agent, but I really don't think because I mean maybe you're wondering could he push it even back further? Like maybe you only want Jones to circle instead of bubble or X, right? So how could you push it back so far into the fact that it basically determines Jones just to do that? And the idea is you could, but then I think you get a deterministic case.
Yeah.
The whole idea is to not get a deterministic case, is to kind of preserve Jones's freedom, indeterministic freedom, uh, that he's not determined at all of his own accord, yet at the same time he doesn't have alternative possibilities. That's the whole idea of a Frankfurt example. But I
Well,
think the problem is when you start pushing it back farther and farther and farther in the agent's mind, you start getting a deterministic case because you start eradicating all those little alternatives. When you
yeah.
start eradicating all those alternatives, that's just determinism,
Well, think of it this
which
way, though. Think of it this way. So the differences in this second case are the style in which he votes, right? With circle,
right,
with an X, however, filling it in. But what if the machine that he was voting on was electronic and all that popped up was two names, one Democrat, one Republican? And then
right,
in that situation, the circum well, I don't know how to describe it. The the way that his desires are manifested can only be in two could only be two ways. Either he votes Democrat or he votes Republican. He either presses that name or presses the other name. And that's it. Like there is, unless like you want to throw in a third option, there's not voting at all, which I'm assuming if he has the will to vote Republican that he will press it. So
right,
it's so if you eliminate all of the mental capacities of desire one way or another, the next would be to eliminate how those desires become manifested in the physical
right,
realm, which
exactly,
outside of limiting the circumstances to the point where there is only two ways that those options are manifested, which in all honesty is not realistic. You could say that at what point in your life is there only two ways to manifest a desire? Like either not or like doing something or not doing something. Like it's that simple. Like, because you could be hungry and want to eat. And I mean, that opens up to you have all different styles of food. Well, I'm desiring you to only eat a sandwich. Well, there's a million different styles of sandwiches. Oh, you only have this ingredient in the fridge. Well, you can make it a different way depending. Like, there's so many ways to customize and manifest a desire in the real world that if you want to really, um, I guess, support the Frankfurt style case, you would have to eliminate all manifestations of a desire, which is,
right.
I would say, I mean, the whole situation is not realistic in the first place, but
Well, the idea is for a Frankfurt style example, it doesn't really matter
yeah.
if they're so outlandish or sci-fi or not realistic. The idea is it logically possible? And yet it is. Like it technically is. There's nothing illogical or metaphysically necessitating the fact that someone couldn't technically invent a machine like that,
Well,
as far as we know.
yeah, it's an
So
electronic machine with only two names that pop on the screen, R or D, and you click one, and that's it.
right,
It
but
records
I
your
think the
vote.
issue is maybe you click on Republican twice. Like you're on, let's just say Biden or Trump. You know you're going to click on Trump in the actual sequence, but maybe you click it and then unclick it, and then click it again because you just like playing around with it, and then click it and unclick
Or
it, and
like
then you leave because it's
you
clicked.
put your
But
finger
that's
on
still a
it
mode.
and hold it there for a second.
Yeah, like you touch the
You
screen, or
slide it.
maybe you
You slide
highlight
your
his
finger.
name, and then you're just kind of giggling because you're playing around, or maybe you're moving your mouse around the screen a little bit and circling Trump's name. Neural firings are still ABC. You're still doing R, right? You're just, oh, that's kind of funny, or that's cute. Or maybe you're just thinking about all the different ways, you're
All right,
fantasizing about
fine.
all the
You
different
win. You
ways
win. Go on. What's your next one, you
Trump
jerk?
can go and make America great again. So you're like,
You give a
this is
little
actually
note. You just wave it out with your mouse before voting.
the point is, I think though this is a nice example to kind of set up the fact that yes, you still have these weak flickers. These are the weak flickers that I don't see how any libertarian could ever attribute to moral responsibility. It's not like, oh, I'm morally responsible because I had the flicker of freedom to circle Trump's name instead
Instead
of
of,
highlighting it.
yeah.
But no one's going to say that, right? No one's, when we think of freedom, we think of either doing this or not doing that,
Yeah.
uh,
Not how you
traditionally.
do
And that
that.
is the liberty of contradiction. And so, what I argue is, I think we need that liberty of contradiction, the not vote Republican or not vote Republican. That is what makes, according to the indeterminists, that's what makes us free. Not just that I have the ability
How?
to vote Republican in different ways.
Yes.
That's the liberty of contrariety. And so what I say is this is a really weak flicker, but it's still flicker. And in order to not beg the question against incompatibilism, I think it's finished. I don't see Frankfurt style examples ever really working unless they make it purely deterministic. But then again, if it's purely deterministic, then it just assumes what it's trying to prove, that Jones doesn't have the ability to do otherwise, yet he's morally responsible. Well, that's just compatibilism, right? So if he's morally responsible, yet he couldn't do otherwise, that's compatibilism. That means he's determined, and you're just starting from your conclusion. So here I propose a solution. Okay? I propose that compatibilists should get rid of the Frankfurt style examples by using them offensively. What that means is using them as the first setup to compatibilism. I don't, as in, like, I don't think we should use Frankfurt style examples to get rid of PAP, because I don't think it's possible, because the flickers of freedom. We can never construe a proper Frankfurt style example, I think, to completely get rid of PAP. I just don't think it's possible to completely get rid of flickers of freedom unless it's already, I think, deterministic. So if that's the case, well, then what are we supposed to do? I think we should rather use Frankfurt style examples just to show source. I am the source of my action, not against PAP, not as a counterexample against PAP, the alternative possibilities. And I think this is plausible. I think that a lot of people can use Frankfurt style examples in this way. And I think that we compatibilists should also use it in that way.
So you're only getting rid of half the problem with Frankfurt style
Yeah,
examples.
so I think I'm getting rid of the more controversial part. So, Frankfurt style examples show Jones to be the source, right, in the actual sequence. But they also show Jones, if they work, that he doesn't have alternative possibilities. I say, no, he will always have alternative possibilities. That could be indeed why he is the source. So, because he has these alternative, although they're extremely weak, to bubble Trump or to highlight Trump, just those modes of the flicker modes is what you could, I guess, call them. The way you vote Republican, those weak flickers. Though Jones cannot will to vote not Republican, he can only vote Republican. Those things pure sourcehood, I think. Those things show us that we are the source in some action, in some way, shape, or form.
Okay.
So, I guess what we could say is, then what? What should the compatibilists do? I think you're the source in some sense. Okay? You are the source in some sense. We should make a deterministic case using Frankfurt style examples. to show that we are still an agent. The reason why is because so many times, as you know, incompatibilists say to compatibilists, "Oh, you're not an agent. You're a passive cog if determinism is true." And so what we can do is we can make even a stronger case, which I won't necessarily bore you with the details, but there are stronger cases like Mealy and Rob's case I would present, and I could say that this case goes further into the mind of the agent than Stump does, completely eradicates strong flickers or weak flickers. There's no more flickers, purely deterministic, and yet what we have the intuition of at the end of the case is not that Pap is false, because that's not what I'm going to use the case for. Rather, we should have the intuition that Jones is still an agent. And if that's the
Well,
case,
yeah.
then we're not using the Frankfurt style example against Pap. We're using the Frankfurt style example to show that Jones can still be an agent even though determinism is true. So you still possess agency though you could not do otherwise. That's what I would think we should use Frankfurt style examples for.
I think I would agree. Yeah. Cuz I'm this might be left field. You know how I am. But when you were explaining that, I started thinking about at least what I personally think happens in a situation of voting Republican or Democrat. I would say obviously it's determined. It's decided well beforehand. Every
Right.
single time you come to the booth, 100 times out of 100 times, with all circumstances being exactly the same, you will go up, you will vote Republican, and you will fill in the circle every time, no matter what.
Right.
And I would
Yep.
say, some people would be like, oh, you're just acting out what you were determined by God to do or determined by the mad scientist to do or whatever. But I would
Right.
contend and say, while that might be true, that voting Republican, was ultimately decided by the scientists beforehand, like that outcome was set in stone. How I got to that was of my own desire. The reasons that I filled in instead of circling or making an X would have been of my own making and my own desires. Just could say I was really nervous about, I really wanted my vote to count. And I read somewhere that filling it in is the best way to do that. And because I really care about this and it's important to me, it becomes imperative that I fill it out, that I fill it in.
Mm.
And I'm always going to come to the booth with the desire to vote Republican and the desire for my vote to count, which is always going to result in me voting Republican with the bubble filled in every single time. Now, where you want to say that those desires come from the evil scientist or mine, my own desires, I think, at least Frankfurt style cases, show that that's kind of irrelevant to the overall actual sequence, I guess you could say. Correct? Am I wrong in saying that?
I don't think you're necessarily wrong. No, if I'm
Um,
understanding you correctly.
yeah. So to me, that would be a deterministic way of looking at that, to where there would be no flickers there. Like my desires are set in stone, and my desires are so strong that they would eliminate all other ways I would go about voting. Like any
Right.
other, like circling or scratching out or any of that. No, it doesn't matter. My desire to have my vote counted based on the information that I had at the time, and to do that was to fill it in. That's the only thing that matters to me. Everything else goes by the wayside. Like, I don't know. So that's just what I was thinking. Like, and I believe that more or less every single decision that you make is a replaying of that kind of sequence of like, based
Right.
on like circumstances plus desires equal outcomes every single time.
Right.
And I know I don't know, that's super rough uh definition or example or explanation, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, that's what I
Right.
think, at least. And I think that
Yeah,
there's
and I think
cases to be made using them to show that
right. So
you're still an agent.
this specific Frankfurt style example that I would be thinking of is what we call blockage cases, and it's kind of an unfortunate name because what it basically says is, the neurons leading to an action, all the neurons that lead to the action, which is not the action that intervener would want, are blocked. So let's just put it with God. God wants you to do X. All the neurons leading to not X, that includes, by definition, A, B, C, D, all that stuff, or just not voting X. Like, for instance, omitting to vote for X. That, like, those not X. That idea is those the idea of a blockage Frankfurt style case means all those other alternatives other than X is blocked. I don't like the word block because it makes it seem like you wanted to reach for it, but you don't have the freedom to reach for it.
You in
I, I
this
don't I don't like
in this
that.
instance, you wouldn't even have the desire to reach for it. You'd
Exactly.
be
So in the actual
incapable.
sequence of events, it's not like not X is blocked. It's that in the actual sequence, you wouldn't even have thought of reasoning about X. And so the idea of that I don't really like blockage the way they're named blockage. They're really just named blockage out of convenience.
Lack of a better word.
Yeah, essentially, yes. Like they're kind of throughout the. Actually, I'm going to read this. I'm just going to try to find it here. Um, Something that I wrote in volume 2, and I said it perfectly. But yeah, they're kind of just named blockage, for lack of a better word. Like it's not actually. It's not that they actually block the alternatives.
It'd be like your desire to walk on all fours is blocked by evolutionary data and so forth. Atomical changes in your body that would make that extremely difficult. You don't have to consider or really have the desire to walk on all fours. You don't even
Right.
think about it. It's like doesn't even cross your mind as a possibility of wanting to do that and thinking it would be comfortable or preferable to walking upright.
Right. Right. So I guess here's what I want to say. It could also be said that blockage cases presents exactly what incompatibilists mean when they suggest that determinism blocks or locks away alternatives in the actual sequence. And I mean, I guess that's true, but the idea is like it is in the name of the case, blockage, but it's just coincidental. The term blockage denotes the severity of the actual sequence mechanism upon the inaccessibility of categorical alternatives, not to denote the elimination or unavailability of alternatives. So I try to make the distinction between inaccessibility to unavailability, and I think those are different. So, for instance, in a blockage case, one in which all flickers are eradicated and you are determined to do what you do, Jones yes, can only do X, but that doesn't mean all other avenues are blocked in the sense that they are inaccessible, or sorry, that they are unavailable to him. They are, in a sense, available to him. It's just the case that they're inaccessible to him. So I think blockage rather should be used as a colloquial term for um, or an innocuous term, like a harmless term for inaccessibility, that Jones does not have the accessibility to open any other door other than X, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think we talked
So
about that a little bit on the podcast before.
right. So the counterfactual mechanism blocks the neural pathways of the agent of the actual sequence, but only to render like one pathway available to the agent, right? Only to allow one neural pathway that is compatible with the agent's already actual progressing decision making at that time. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So it's to me, and that's I guess I'm not the one who originated the term, but it's called occurrent preemption. So occurrent just means simultaneous preemption, and to me, this is how I view regeneration. This is how I view all God's causal workings in the world, specifically deficient causation. So God's deficient causation of omitting to his hand of grace, omitting to put his hand of grace in a certain situation. Um, the way he omits his hand causally necessitates deficiently how the agent would sin in that way. But it just so happens that the agent would sin that way in the exact same way, if God would to refrain. I don't know how to explain it. If God were to refrain his hand in a similar situation in the exact same way. So, in other words, agent would have already chosen that out of his own volition without God forcing him to do it. So we call that occurrent preemption. And I think regeneration can be similar. And I think God foreknows the future in that way too. So
Hmm. Okay. I don't
so
have
it's a
anything
pretty
to add.
interesting. This is why I think Frankfurt style examples are so nerdy for me, because I think
I
they open up so
I
so many
feel
doors.
I feel exhausted after that. Like truthfully, like not in a bad way. I'm just like, dude, how do we expect this to be like intuitive for people? Like it's nowhere near
No, I don't think
intuitive.
it. I mean,
Doesn't
I
have
don't
to
think it
be,
is
but that
intuitive.
like it
Right.
makes the barrier of entry um a lot
I
higher.
think people. This is kind of a side note, and this is what I've noticed in my other podcast today too, is that people we want things to be intuitive for people
Yep.
only because this is my own personal theory. I could be wrong. You can fight back, but only because we just don't want to do the homework,
Of
and
course
so
we
we
don't.
just want. Yeah, so we
I
we
don't
just
even want to
want things
read
to be
half the
easy.
crap I'm reading right now.
Like I'm a math teacher. I know like kids just want to take pictures of the math problem and then submit it as their own. They just want like popcorn math. Like they just want to here's the answer, get the grade. Here's the answer, get the grade. We don't
Yeah.
want to actually do the work, the progression, the learning, and challenge some of our own intuitive things about mathematics. Instead, we just want to go through the motions and just call it good. We don't actually want to think about these issues. Um, and I think that's the beauty about philosophy is it challenges a lot of intuitive natures, like
Yeah.
what we would intuitively think about certain issues, and then brings them to light so that we can actually do the homework and think for ourselves.
It's okay, so another visual that I had in my head while you were talking is I would have never in all my days come to this conversation or these ideas without you 100%. Like for whatever reason you ventured into this world and then brought me with you, which I'm fine with admitting. I don't care. I'm not this smart. I'm I will forever and always be riding on the coattails of Colin Carlson when it comes to theological philosophy and stuff like this. I could kick his ass at the Bible. I can tell you that. I know Greek and Hebrew much better than he does, and I can pull scripture and I can study it better than him. I got him there. But when it comes to the philosophy side of it, I don't have I don't care enough to do the homework necessarily. But what it does do is I think that you kind of like found an abandoned house and like you saw that it like, oh, this is a really well built house. It's just dirty. Like let me clean it up, let me make it livable and beautiful to look at and nice to be in. And then you just brought me along and said, hey, look, check out this awesome house I found. It has all this detail, like all the rooms are furnished, like heating and cooling, like all the amenities I would want in a really nice house. And you're just like, dude, check it out. Like you can stay here and live with me if you want. And now I'm just chilling in this house that I didn't find and I didn't fix up and I don't know how to build and I don't understand how it works, but I recognize that it is a awesome house to live in, and I appreciate it, and I find it beautiful, and I find it interesting, and that's basically where I'm at right now with all of this philosophical crap. I feel like that was an
I
elegant way to
think
say it.
no, like I think that's right. I think I almost I don't know if I'll ever get a doctorate, if I'll be in like the I don't know, the equivalent of Ivy League philosophy. It would be nice, but I don't really, it's not on my purview right now. But I do like trying to teach others who aren't willing to do the homework. If
Shortcuts.
they're willing to at least learn, then I love teaching others the differing avenues for this debate. And not, I guess not just with regards to free will, but like that's why I teach philosophy to high school students, right?
Yeah,
Because I like teaching them the introductory issues in philosophy, like with regards to epistemology and knowledge and the philosophy of religion, like does God exist or blah blah blah. Like all those things are really interesting, and I just really like doing that. I'm a teacher at heart, you know.
obviously.
And so I'm always gonna want to teach others what I learn. I mean, that's just I think what a God given thing, you know, that He has implanted in me.
Yeah.
Whether it's philosophy, math, religion, Bible, relationships. I think it's a gift, but I get what you're saying. It's not necessarily intuitive. Like you would never,
Yeah.
the average man, even probably some of our podcast listeners, you know, they're not gonna come to this and be like, "Oh yeah, for sure." Like
I already know about that.
obviously,
I already read on that. Like I already. Oh yeah, Stump read all her stuff. I know exactly who that is.
right?
I it, and it, I mean, part of that is just the culture that we live in. I even find myself. I have so many things that pull at my mental attention that it's very hard for me to focus on trying to even read uh Preciado's book right now. Like I spent freaking 2 hours making a highlight video of Vikings plays like that I'm gonna put on YouTube later just for fun. That'll probably get copyright strike and taken down. But it was just fun to do, and I had my kids and shopping and a trip to plan for. Like there's some, obviously there's a lot of things like mentally there it's hard to find the bandwidth to try to venture into these things. But that's part of why I wanted to record these conversations in the first place. Because us having these conversations over the phone, I'm like, I could very easily see other people following along and being like, holy crap, never thought about it this way. And that's why I felt it was really important to record and put it out there to hopefully nudge people along that same path and find maybe if it's not Colton's house where I'm staying at least find their own house and fix it up a bit and, hop into, all these other great theologians that we're mentioning and there's others out there that don't agree with us that have great stuff to say on this stuff. Go stay at their house. I don't care. Just be thinking about these things in a responsible way. Um, and I find it helpful. And I do think overall it will advance the faith in some way, shape, or form to some person somewhere, or maybe a great number of
Right.
people overall eventually, hopefully. That's kind of the overall goal. But it's hard because I try to have these mention a little pieces of our conversation with my pastor, like the intern pastor, who's also like my best friend in Kansas City, who I probably spend the most time with. And he always gives me the same response. He's like, I'm glad you guys are looking into this, and I find it like interesting to, think about here and there, but ultimately he's like, I don't care and I don't find it something I need to be spending my time on because I'm a pastor and most people that come to church don't care about these things. And when it comes to the faith, it's not that important to be dogmatic on these issues or to even bring these issues to light for someone who's a new Christian. And I would agree with him. Remember, I always say like I'm pragmatic first. This stuff is not very pragmatic. Like it's not obviously pragmatic, I would say. I think it has its uses, but it's underneath a lot of intellectual rigor, I would say. Um, which I'm not expecting new believers to be interested in doing, and that's fine. Um, so yeah, it's I don't know. It's hopefully not a lost cause. Hopefully someone cares, but I'm not banking on it per se. But
Yeah, I
yeah,
remember.
go ahead.
Sorry, I just remember talking to one of my good friends too, and he basically said like something extremely similar. Actually, he's like, I like the practical side of Christianity, and he loves listening to Jordan Peterson, um, and he uses a lot of his practical elements in his talks, and he tries to incorporate them because, well, they're practical, and he can tangibly touch them like mentally and use them. Right? And I think the reason why philosophy is so kind of a disdain against other people, for most people, the vast majority of people, is because they don't tangibly see the value of philosophy. And I would just like to say that once I understood the tangible value of philosophy, it really changed. And I teach it to my students, but it changed how I view like these intellectual pursuits. Now, it doesn't change how I view all intellectual disputes. Like, I obviously am going to talk about more so free will. Why? Because soteriology interests me, and regeneration, and how we become Christians, and how we're saved. Like, and if we have the freedom to be saved, of course, that interests me more than, like, let's just say the philosophy of mind, or are we robots, or how do we come to know things, or even apologetics. Once upon a time, I was kind of into apologetics,
It's
and
so
honestly, it
hard.
was boring. Like, to me, it was just boring because it was very stagnant and it wasn't like alive intellectually, and it was just like memorize these facts and then God exists. And it was like, really? Like, honestly? I mean, obviously, I believe God exists, and I think apologetics is useful, and that intellectual pursuit is good and applicable, and I can see it for what it is, and I can use it when I need to use it. But the difference is, I would rather, pursue something that is more alive intellectually, like the freedom debate.
Yeah,
All that to say is, the value of philosophy, the reason why I think people ought to think about these things, not just free will, but about just philosophy in general, whatever interests you particularly, is because it pushes you outside of your um, intuitive comfort zone. So like we naturally are intuitive creatures. We're fickle creatures. We want to do things that are intuitive to us, that take the least amount of work to us. We just naturally do that. And I think philosophy is on the end kind of goading us to say like we can think more deeply about these matters than we ever have before. And I think the practical side is that once we do, I think we would, to me at least, as a Christian, gain a much deeper appreciation for what God has created with our
mhm,
mind. It's not just that when you say love God with all of our mind, heart, soul, strength, whatever. I mean, it takes a whole nother lens, a whole nother, atmosphere of what it means to love God intellectually with your mind. And I think that is uh, just a pragmatic way of studying philosophy.
no, and I agree, and that's why I'm doing this stuff with you alongside you, because I even find when I get myself in like debates or even like these mental wrestlings that I have, and I'm like trying to get back into the word and studying and looking at verses and looking at the Greek structure and what did this word mean in this context. I find it super helpful. Like I'm interested in that. And by the way, undefeated when I think something says something in the Greek and I actually go look it up and I'm like, yes, it actually does say this. Like I've yet to be proven wrong with that. I'm undefeated on the thread when it comes to that stuff. But in that way I've seen it helpful. And in it I think for me mostly it has voiced and gave me vocabulary of things that I always thought, but I didn't know how to say it. I didn't know what it was
Right.
called. I've
I think
I realized I've always been a determinist. Actually, if I'm being honest with myself, I've always been that way. Like far back as I can remember, I'm like, yeah, God is in control of all things. God knows all things. God will bring about his plan ultimately at the end of all things. Like, I've always thought that. Like, and then the freedom side of it, I mean, it feels like we have freedom, but I can easily be like, I do have freedom, but I don't have it in a libertarian sense. And I think I would have always agreed with that if I knew what it meant. Like, even, as a young Christian, I just didn't know how to say it. So it kind of confirms intuitions I had about the world, and then gave me words to describe them, and then made me feel like I'm not a complete weirdo, loser, or freak, or just like totally outside of, out of touch with reality or something like that.
Right.
Because it's
So think back at like
plausible.
Miss Curtis when she taught English. She gave us vocabulary to access certain feelings and thoughts about life, about philosophy, sometimes,
Sin.
about literature, and about just truth in general, the truth about humanity and how we ought to view it and ask big questions. All those things she gave, mere dumb, horny teenagers
I wasn't
access
horny.
to. Right. 11th grade. So, but she gave us access to all these things that we didn't know we even needed access to.
Yeah.
And after the class, we're like, holy crap, it changed our mind, it changed our perspective. And I think that's exactly what philosophy does do. Like, once you learn it, you can never go back to
Mhm.
how it was before, because your knowledge is just vastly uh, changed, and I think for the better. Philosophy is an art, just like literary criticism or just like poetry. It's not as elegant, I think, as some other arts, but it is an art, I think,
It's just
nonetheless.
as
So,
beautiful, I think. Um, I wanted to have one more topic that I've been mulling in my head, um, if you would like.
sure.
And it's about what what are things that we should be dogmatic about, and what are things that we should hold, I would call it, with an open hand when it comes to our beliefs and how we understand the Bible. Because I think the discussion around open theism, around Calvinism, and around
Yeah.
Molinism, all the isms, I mean, I would say that the biblical data that supports each side of that debate ultimately is inconclusive, right?
I mean, that's what I've been saying for years.
Yes. Because you can find verses that seemingly support Calvinism, but you can easily find
Right.
sources that seemingly support open theism. These things you cannot be dogmatic about given the scripture. And I think that is an okay place to be, at least in my head. Like, I'm fine with holding, well, frankly, everything we talk about in this podcast. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Hold it with an open hand. I could care less if I'm proven 100% wrong tomorrow. Like, it does not matter that much to me. It doesn't, my faith isn't built on it. My ideas about God wouldn't change all that much. Um, my history, my relationship, how I, interact with God, none of that would change. Like, honestly, because it hasn't been important to me, and it hasn't been dogmatic for me either. And I think that I venture to say that a lot of the people that we interact with, that would not be the case. For most of them, that they are really dogmatic. Like, if determinism is true, like, holy cow, that would make God murderous and, a moral monster if he does determine. Like, a lot of people would be in of that mindset if somehow that got proven true, which I don't find it helpful or in a good spot to be. If that is, it's like, I either have to be right about this point that is inconclusive in the scripture, or I'm essentially not going to be a Christian. That's a very bad place, I think, for someone to be. And there's so many things that are like that in the Bible. Like, if you want to get into a hot mess of like literature and academics look at the academic understanding of the Bible and the scripture. Like, there's no historical David. Like, there's no historical Moses. Obviously, no historical Adam. There's no archaeological evidence that Israel was ever a united kingdom. There's no archaeological evidence that Solomon and his temple was as grand as he said it was. Like, it was, there's absolutely no history or mention of Hebrews in ancient Egypt. But, they might be the Hyksos. Oh, they might, but we don't know. Like, the first pharaoh that is actually mentioned that we have archaeological evidence for was Shawshank, and he was in the 9th century BC, like 900. And obviously there's a lot of story before that in the Bible. Like, there's no historical Abraham, obviously. Like, all of these things, like the Pentateuch was obviously written by at least 4 different contributors. Like, there's no end to, like chattel slavery is explained in Leviticus. Like, it condones slavery. Like, homosexual sin, like, it's not the lifestyle, it's the act of penetrating a man, and there's something about that was declared sinful. So there's so many things like that in the Bible. Like, and that's just the Old Testament. Of, you start, like, even the age of the earth, like, you start to hold a lot of this stuff with an open hand, I think, as you become more educated as a Christian. Because I think if you build your faith around it, like, apologetics can be dangerous because you start to think that those things are way more important than they actually are when it comes to having a robust, like, faith and a robust spiritual life. So in some ways it can be dangerous, and people fall away because they find that their intuitions about faith and what they're taught in the churches and what they thought was true and what they thought was certain, these stories are 100% true. They're not just literary devices. And if that's not true, then the Bible's not trustworthy and God is a deity of deception, and we all start sounding like Stratton at some point. That's a joke. But I think you get the point that it's okay to not be dogmatic about those things that we can't be sure of, and we shouldn't be building our faith around those things either. So really, as I always say, it boils down to, what is your opinion of Jesus? Do you believe him? And luckily, when it comes to historical data and archaeological evidence and historical proof, Jesus is the gold standard for ancient history. There's nothing more true when it comes to ancient history than the story of Jesus. There's more material about him than anything else, and it's like by 30 times. And the timing in which we hear about him is like, it could be as few as 100 years after his death, which is absolutely unheard of for things that are 2,000 years old. So Jesus, historically and academically speaking, definitely did exist. It's not a point of contention. So whether you believe the stories in the gospel, if it played out that way, if you believe that he actually did, become alive again and resurrected, and if you believe the accounts of that, and it's not just a made up fable that, everyone after built their whole lives around and was willing to go to literal death to defend that. That's where, if you want to do apologetics, look at the history of the early church and verify their accounts and find if you believe them or not. Because essentially that's what we're stuck with, even in an academic sense. So forget the Old Testament completely and how you understand that. Look at the story of Jesus and his life and make a decision based off of that information. And I'm not saying that, apologetics in the Old Testament is like unhelpful, or that we should throw the whole Testament out. It has nothing to offer. It's not true. Literally, it's literally not true, but it is true in a sense that if it was included in God's story of our history. So I have to feel like there is some truth to it. Like, a gun to my head, I do think a literal David and a literal Solomon existed, and a literal Abraham and a literal Adam existed. But if I was told that they didn't exist, then I don't really care that much, because their stories still are important to the narrative of Scripture overall. So I don't know where I'm getting at, but I would just warn you to be careful about what you're dogmatic about. And these things should not be something that dictate whether you have faith or not. It should be almost irrelevant. So I don't know. What do you think about that, Colton?
Um, Depends. So, yeah, I think there are certain things that we should be dogmatic about, and I think that there are some things that you shouldn't be dogmatic about. Um, so, for instance, like at the age of the earth, or um, like whether or not the author of Hebrews is in fact Paul, or the post-tribulation premillennium, or the rapture, or amillennialism, Calvinism or Arminianism, open theism, determinism. Those things I don't think you should be dogmatic about. I think that the Christian, though, should be dogmatic about something like what the Nicene Creed says. So the Trinity. So I think you should be dogmatic about the Trinity. You should be dogmatic about uh, the economic roles of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and that all are God, equal persons, but differing only in essence or substance or something like that. So I think that you should be dogmatic about those issues. I've heard some people say that you don't need to be dogmatic about the Virgin Mary. I mean,
There's wiggle room
depends.
in Hebrew. There's wiggle room. Doesn't mean
I think
virgin.
there's
It means
wiggle
young
room.
room. Means young
Yeah, I
woman.
guess all is up for interpretation. I'm going to say that I think you should, because I think the creeds lead room, like they don't necessarily leave room for you not believing in the Virgin
Well,
Mary. Is there any logical
I want to
possibility
mention something really quick because
for not being
even though it says that
for not
even though it says that in Hebrew, the
what?
Jews were known to go back and change words in the Old Testament to make it sound like it wasn't about Jesus. So actually, the Septuagint, when it comes to accuracy, is the most accurate, even though it was a translation. But you can't trust the pesky Sadducees and the Pharisees after Jesus came because they rewrote some stuff to make it sound like Jesus wasn't the Messiah. And that could have been one thing that they rewrote. Just saying. Just
Could be. I would just say I think I'm going to side with the creeds and the history. Is that logical?
I'm saying it is. It very well could be.
I have no idea. Like, is it logical just to side with the creeds and the confessions and so forth? Maybe not. I think, though, I'm hesitant for the Virgin Mary. Let's just say that. I think they should, but would I call someone if they didn't believe in the Virgin Mary? Would I call them not a Christian? Probably not. But if they say, Christ um, was created, then I would not call them a Christian. So I think the Chalcedonian Creed is something that we should take to heart. So God is fully man, fully God. Or sorry, Christ is fully man, fully God. And the negative nature of how they did that, the Chalcedonian Creed was like the negative explanations that they gave was that Christ is not this and Christ is not that. I think that is sufficient. So all that to say is you should believe that Christ is God. I think that is what Christianity entails. So there are certain things that are dogmatic about Christianity that I think that we ought to remain dogmatic about, but there's other things like the age of the earth or something, or you know um, when Christ will come and how he's going to come, eschatological matters like that. Certain interpretations of scriptures, I don't think we should be dogmatic about. The gospel, we should be dogmatic about. So, like, what is required for salvation, I think we need to be dogmatic about that. And that's when they should, non-Calvinists and Calvinists, non-Arminians and Arminians, all theological systems would agree, should agree on what the gospel is. Now, some people want to say that like Arminianism is heresy or Calvinism is heresy because of God's character being destroyed or whatever. I would say no, because God's character, though some things are explicit, their view doesn't naturally unravel that the explicit uh, um, their view doesn't naturally unravel the explicit nature of that heresy. Let's just say that. So, for instance, if Calvinism is true, Arminians or really hard anti-Calvinists would want to say, um, whether they're Arminian or not, would want to say that Calvinism destroys the nature of God, so therefore it's heresy because it determines evil, although deficiently or whatever. They don't make that distinction. And we're going to say, no, it doesn't. God is still omnibenevolent. But you know what's happening here? We all agree God is omnibenevolent. It's just the case that they think our view entails that God isn't actually omnibenevolent, but we do believe that God is, in fact, omnibenevolent. And so, those things of what we believe and what our view necessarily entails is, I think, different. And I think those things that we actually do believe, I think Calvinism is completely orthodox in that manner. And so is a plethora of other theological issues. So, um, I think generally I would agree with you.
A very long way to say that. It was just something I was thinking about because I yeah, with like what happened with Tyler and what I see. I was watching this video about like the personality makeup of people who are atheists, and actually they perfectly fit with my personality type, which is ENTJ, and like the TJ, like the thinking and judging part of that like anagram is you're twice as likely to leave the faith or become atheist if you're a TJ. And the way that those people are described is critical thinkers who challenge what they've been told and go out and find out if it's true. Like it's very important for them to know truth. And I was thinking about that in my own life, and I'm like, it's always been important for me to find truth. Like I scrutinize and criticize everything I think, like to the bone. Like I'll argue with myself, but I've never questioned my faith though. Like it's never crossed my mind. And there's been like little hints of it coming from like, okay, crap. Like if the world isn't 6,000 years old, like how can I become a Christian? Or oh crap, like if a historical Abraham didn't exist, how can I still be a Christian? There was definitely not 2 million Jews living in Egypt at the time that they said there was. There might not have been any Jews. How can I still be a Christian? And I could easily see how these little details would come up with someone of my mindset. It would cause them to, see the scriptures as something that is untrustworthy. But I remember also thinking at the same time that is not important to me. It's not like that phrase got repeated in my head a lot. I was like, my faith is not based on a historical Israel in Egypt. Like my faith is based on Jesus Christ. Like that was a common reoccurrence. And I'm okay with holding the intellectual dissonance of, yeah, there are some things in the Bible that we cannot historically explain. Lack of evidence or the fact that it maybe didn't happen the way the Bible described does not matter to me, because that's not what the ultimate truth that I find in the gospel is. It's not that. So I think it's fine to say that I don't know, and I hold a lot of the Bible with an open hand. And there's very few things I'm dogmatic about, which is why I can scrutinize ideas and take on new ideas and frankly change my mind very easily if it comes up that I find something else to be more true. And I feel like we're going to have to take that mindset as Christians a lot more. As we go into the internet age is firmly taken hold, and this next generation of Christian that's coming up, they will be bombarded by oh, the Bible wasn't historically accurate about this and this and this and this, and it condones slavery and all this other details, like that's going to be hitting them constantly everywhere. And if we're still teaching in the church that you have to believe this to be a good Christian, we're kind of screwed. And you can already see the effects on that, on like the Christians who are our age and younger. It's just keeps going down and down and down and down. So I that's what I really love about my church, is because we don't stress those details. We will tell those stories. Like we went through Nehemiah, and it's like, it doesn't matter if this is historically accurate, because the feelings and the emotions and the stories and the people involved, like these tell a relevant story to us nowadays. Like it had a literary purpose. There's a reason for it to be in the Old Testament. And I think when, unfortunately, you look at the Bible as a literary device like Jordan Peterson does, not that I endorse all of his work, but I appreciate his mindset of looking at these as meta stories instead of historical data. Because ultimately, the Jewish people were more interested in making theological points than being historically accurate. That was never their goal. It is a story that tells theological truths about God, and those truths about God are true. That I can be certain of. So read this story not for what the story is saying, but what truth does this reveal about God's character? Because there's even strong evidence that Jonah is a like children's play that would be performed at different holidays, as like a spoof or a joke almost. Not that it was not a joke as in haha this is ridiculous, but it was like a comedy, like a very poignant, upfront, in your face story about how God can treat people and how he forgives, and oh, you don't want to do my will, well, I'm going to make a whale swallow you and take you to where I want to be. And so it tells a theological truth about God in the form of a play. And the same thing with what was it, Ezra? Not Ezra. Esther is also like a play, like a Shakespearean type play with political drama and intrigue and seduction and all of the makings of a great modern day Hollywood movie, but all that to tell a theological truth about God, that regardless of the historical accuracy of the story, the theological truth about God is still intact. So I don't know, it's just mullings thinking about it, and I think it needs to be more of an emphasis in the church. Like, let's teach theology, not dogmatic beliefs about stories that we can't possibly know are accurate or not.
Right.
We'll never have the
I
data
think
for that.
This is one reason why. I mean, I've had many non-Calvinists criticize me for basically not engaging with the scriptures in a debating theological sense, and I just, they find it astonishing that a Calvinist would actually be willing to admit that. That will actually be willing to admit that the scriptures aren't helpful in ascertaining philosophical data. But then I find it surprising and astonishing that that is even an astonishment for them. I mean, clearly the Bible is dogmatic about certain things and it's dogmatic about other things. I think it's dogmatic about theological issues. It's not dogmatic about philosophical issues, which is why I think we should just look at the Bible at face value and see its compatibility with a plethora of other different views. And whatever those, whatever those views are, whether it's determinism, open theism, Molinism, Roman Catholicism, whatever, Eastern Orthodox, whatever those views are, I think it should be compatible with the scriptures. Right, but that's why I refuse. That's why I refuse to kind of tread the waters, because I see what you're trying to say, that it's hard to be dogmatic about certain issues because it's just some verses imply
The
this, some
scriptures
verses
are
imply that.
inconclusive, not unhelpful, but inconclusive. I think the biblical
Right.
data is obviously inconclusive, which I feel like would be news to like 90% of the people we talk to about this stuff. Like
Well, that's
I think I'll make a post tomorrow literally saying I truly believe that the biblical data about the isms we've been talking about is inconclusive, 1,000%,
Right.
and I'm okay with that. That
Yeah,
doesn't
and I'm
affect me.
okay with it too. And everyone wants to be like, oh, what'd you say? I'm like, aren't you sola scriptura? Don't you believe that the Bible is like the end all be all? And the idea is that's not, first of all, that's not what sola scriptura means. But second of all, it is again not a philosophical textbook. Like I'm not going to use the Bible to tell me what
It's also not a
um,
history book.
right. It's not a history book. I'm not going to use the Bible to teach me about history, although it teaches history.
Yes,
I'm not going to use the Bible to learn how to do philosophy or how to do science, although
it
it
is
includes all those
philosophical in
things.
nature.
Right. It, and I think the idea and the presupposition of some of these, let's just call them dogmatics, of people who just look to the Bible for every nook and cranny of it, which I almost say kudos, and that's fine. But when it comes to hard questions like the problem of evil or um, the isms that we're talking about, it it gives a preliminary discussion of the topic, yes, but to me, and I just think that's all it does. All it does is give a preliminary discussion of the topic. It doesn't go any further to actually give answers to some of these hard questions. Like for instance, does God exist? What does the Bible do? It presupposes God's existence.
Doesn't prove it. It just says it is.
Yeah, it doesn't prove it. It presupposes it, and that's fine. Guess what? Because it's not supposed to argue for God's existence. It was never supposed to do that. And so the idea
It's
of
funny
God's
that the
existence, even
Bible
though
is
it's
not
presupposed,
apologetic to itself.
right?
The Bible doesn't. How would you say that? It's not apologetic in nature to prove its own existence. Like it just is, which is funny.
God just is existing given the scriptures, and that's fine,
Hmm.
right? And so when atheists say, "Well, it never proves," like it doesn't need to prove, right? That's what the mind is for. That's what arguments are for. That's what philosophy is for. That's what natural theology is for. Um, and so I just never understood these kinds of people who are very dogmatic about certain things, like not just about issues in the Bible, but how to use the Bible.
Yeah,
That to me is that rubs me the wrong way, I think. So
yeah, because we start showing ourselves as dated people, and then we also drive away the people who come into contact with these historical issues or all of the things I mentioned already. And if we try to give them crappy answers and they see right through it, and we don't just admit to them, hey, we just don't know, but it's not important to what I believe. I feel like that is way more powerful of an answer and has a more of a overall positive experience for people than to give them some BS explanation from some kookhead apologist who's been disproven by about a million other critical thinkers and writers about the topic. So like it it overall, it's something that we've been doing, especially in Western Christianity for a while now. It really got popular in the 40s and the 50s, being dogmatic about these things, and I don't want to say it's gotten worse, but it's been a tactic that is becoming way more damaging than it is helpful. And I think it's time that we start admitting there's a lot of things about the Bible that we don't know, but that doesn't change what we believe about God, and that's fine.
right.
And that, yeah,
Yeah, I always say this is on topic but sort of off topic. I always hate when, and I have a coworker like this too, where they just cite science and basically is like, oh, so God doesn't exist, right? It doesn't make any sense to me, like at all. It's almost as if like it's either science or God, and that's just a
yeah,
false dichotomy. Like there's no way that that's the case. I mean, behind my bookshelf, I can at least point to 5 books that completely dismantle that notion.
yeah.
And have I read those books? I'll be honest, no. Do I need to? Nope. What I do need to know is that they exist and that people have thought long and hard about these topics and have actually argued for the truth in Christianity in light of scientific data. So just saying, "Oh, science exists, so God doesn't exist," is just ignorant because clearly those people don't think so. So unless you have a better argument, then you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so to me, it's just the very nature of people coming against this kind of dogmatic approach, either Christian or non-Christian. Um, the very nature of people having different views, I think, disproves this dogmatic approach.
Yeah.
People have differing views all the time. That should be enough to eradicate our dogmatics.
And it's hard though, because I don't expect, like, if all Christians adopted my mindset on this, I don't know if it would be an overall positive. I think it would, but it may just be that like Christianity becomes almost weaker in a cultural sense, that it doesn't have, the, I don't even know what it would I don't even know what it would look like. But I'm not saying I'm even confident in saying what I'm saying, I guess, on these matters. Because there's people who are much smarter than me who have spent a longer time thinking about this and who have frankly been way better Christians than I could ever hope to be, led way more people to Christ than I could ever hope to imagine. And they were dogmatic about these things and it wasn't necessarily a problem for them. So it almost could be like a cop out in my own head that like, oh, I don't need to research this. I don't need to be dogmatic. I don't need to risk myself looking like an idiot to an atheist because I don't hold hard and near and dear all of these historical things, blah, blah, blah. But that could be what turns someone else on to Christianity. Like, it's so hard. And then, especially being a determinist and a Calvinist, use that as a tool for evangelism. Good freaking luck. Because I could literally look an atheist in the eyes, be like, the atheist could say, well, God hasn't given me the ability to believe in him. So I'm going to hell, right? Because I just don't have the ability. And I'll be like, yep. And he was like, and God determined me to not have the ability. And I'll be like, yep. And like, that doesn't sound fair. I'm like, doesn't sound fair, but it is fair. How? How is that fair? Well, we could get into a conversation about like, well, regardless, you're a sinner, you're choosing that. It was like, well, why are you a believer and I'm not? It was like, well, God determined me to be a believer. So what's the difference between me and you? What did you do to become a believer and I'm not a believer? Well, I don't know. God just chose me. I don't really have a good answer for you. I can't say that God can still choose you. You're still alive. Like, you could still become a believer. But at that point, like, I would have to concede to the atheist, like, yeah, the reason you don't believe could almost in a circular sense be God's fault. If you really want to be mopey about it. And in that sense, it's not a very good tool for angsty atheist to go up against, because I would basically tell them that they're right. So in that way, I'm kind of like questioning its pragmatic. I mean, that situation doesn't come up a whole lot, nor would I be dogmatic in even saying it. I'd be like, well, I don't really know. I'm not really sure. I have beliefs about it, but it could be that God determined you not to believe. But you don't know that. I don't know that. Has God come down and told you that you were determined not to believe? Like, how can we even be sure that that's the truth? Because you're still alive and breathing. So I don't know. I'm talking myself in a circle, but it's interesting to think about. And it's a mental back and forth sometimes on this, because at least if you're an Arminius, you can just blame free will constantly, literally for everything. Like, oh, you're choosing not to be a believer, and it's like, well, while that's true, if you're a Calvinist also, but it's God is the only one who's going to pull you out of that. And if people who really want to be pissed off at God, that's a good reason to be pissed off at him. Like, well, he didn't choose me. Now I'm mad at God. Now I want to fight God. Now God is my enemy. He chose me to burn in hell. Like, we're going to go with Satan, because at least Satan can sympathize with our position as the forgotten and lost people that God didn't care enough to save. And I'd be like, yep, sucks to suck. And I'm not even happy about it. I'm not even like, I don't even feel good about that. But is that true? I think Obviously, as a Calvinist, I would say yes. I think that's a tool that Satan can use to draw people to him. But if I just blame it on free will, even if I'm being intellectually dishonest, at least I'm not getting myself in hot water with atheists. What do you think?
I essentially agree. I mean, there's nothing really more to add. So, um, yeah.
Sucks though.
We haven't really gotten into which, if we want, we can just push it to a next episode. But the foreknowledge idea, but that's up to you. It's pretty late, so
Well, honestly, it's more up to you. You're the one who's going to be doing all the talking.
we can do it at a different episode and close this one out.
Okay. Let me think. Do I have anything else I want to add or talk about or complain about? I don't think so. Although I do think whatever the actual true nature of reality is and how God relates to freedom, we just have no idea. And we're like groping around in the darkness over things that are half true. But ultimately, our brains are incapable of understanding God's mysterious way he works in the universe, and ultimately won't figure it out till we're born, like brought up to heaven with him. Fair enough, Colton.
Fair enough.
I'm good calling it there. Code word Cheetos. I'm good if you're good.
I'm good.
All right. I'll hopefully get this uploaded, and hopefully it won't be too long before we do another recording. So hopefully it won't be like 2 or 3 months. Hopefully it'll just be a couple weeks, but we'll see what our schedules are looking like. We're getting into the unknown period and busy period for Colton again, so we'll see what happens. Alrighty, peace, y'alls. Bye.